You have various pieces about racism in foreign policy and race just in general when it comes to forming policy. You've talked about anti-Japanese sentiment really driving some of that policy development in U.S. engagement after World War II. We are seeing tensions between the U.S. and China and other nations as well. What's the first thing that the Biden administration needs to consider as it really forms its foreign policy?
Thank you so much for having me, Shery. It's a pleasure, and I really commend you and your team for having this important set of conversations. So, as I've written recently in Foreign Policy magazine, our foreign policy needs to begin right here at home. In the last 4 years, the U.S. has abandoned many international institutions it helped create. The U.S. has alienated many important allies while gravitating towards historical adversaries, and our human rights record is nowhere near where it should be when we look at policies like the travel bans targeted at nationals of select Muslim majority nations and African nations. When you look at the crisis and humanitarian disaster at the southern border, because we have been closing off our borders to people who are coming to our shores for a better life and for safety from persecution. When all these things are happening, we are not at our best. In fact, we are perpetuating human rights abuses. And so for the Biden administration to have a credible foreign policy, we have to really look in and address human rights issues at home, especially if we seek to be a champion of and a diplomat for human rights on the world stage.
But I guess the question then is, does the United States really want to be a champion in the world stage? We have seen more isolationist tendencies coming from the U.S. administration and perhaps a little bit of exhaustion coming from the American public when it comes to engagements abroad as well. So how do you reconcile these two issues?
Yeah, that's an astute observation. A lot of Americans have been looking in, and there have in recent years been many isolationist policies. But if you look at some of the campaign promises and calls to action from President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, then candidates, you see that they want to get the U.S. back into international institutions, back in a leadership role, back with a larger sphere of influence and promoting American democratic values, including, but not only human rights.
What does a rethinking of race and the implications that it has within international relations look like for the US? What does that look like for hiring, for example? Is it the same as what you would recommend corporations in terms of, hitting these diversity targets and the importance of having diverse representative employees in doing the job that they do within IR?
Oh, yes, definitely. Thank you. It's very important that we increase the presence and status and recognition of diverse individuals, not only in the international relations classroom, which is where I spend a lot of my time, but also among international affairs professionals, whether that's in think tanks, in policymaking bodies, et cetera, because the more perspectives you have, and especially different perspectives, the more likely you are to come up with creative solutions to thorny issues. And so we've actually been missing out a lot and perhaps not producing the best policies that we could, because different perspectives have been missing from the table. When you have policies like the global gag rule, that reflects a foreign policy and really a domestic policy that doesn't center, for example, women. Or when you have, leaders using expletives to describe the nationals of foreign nations that perhaps are less developed, that's based in a racist orientation, looking outwards, but also inwards, and that reflects the absence of diverse perspectives, or certainly a respect for diverse perspectives if they are around the table, in terms of how ideas are expressed and how policies are developed and enacted. And so it's really encouraging for me as a human rights scholar, as a scholar of international relations, to see such a diverse cabinet with the Biden administration, not only in foreign policy arenas, but also in domestic policy arenas, that we will have greater representation of perspectives and ideas that will hopefully result in policies that reflect the United States and that reflect the nation's purported values around the world.
Are you seeing that shift take place in academia as well, where, of course, as you've pointed out, so much of the scholarship, the scholarly research, the paradigms have been set by, a demographic which is very much white and male?
Yes, we are definitely seeing shifts, especially over the course of the last year. So last summer, my colleague Meredith Logan, an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, we came together to write an essay in Foreign Policy magazine called Why Race Matters in International Relations, where we highlight and center some of the amazing work that has been done over the last several years and decades that brings a critical perspective to international relations, that asks us to interrogate what security means, what cooperation means, what development means. And so these conversations, which perhaps were not in the mainstream, have entered the mainstream, and we've been encouraged by the positive reception. The essay is required reading in over 80 academic institutions in 24 countries around the world and growing. It's really important for us as educators who are training tomorrow's voters, foreign policy professionals, nonprofit leaders, and civil society advocates to not take as given concepts like anarchy, power, security, cooperation, and really to engage critical approaches like critical race IR, feminist IR, and third world IR. These conversations have been largely missing, and it's really on us to bring them into the classroom so that our students understand the field and that they participate in politics in positive ways. And I also think it's important for us to consider how racial hierarchies are perpetuated in classrooms and in the international system, and to really question whether things like development, modernity, civilization, are these inherent attributes, or are they tropes that are being used to justify subjugation around the world? And so I see the conversation changing, shifting in academia and also in policymaking circles.